He proposed to her on Valentine's Day.
The wedding was beautiful. She seemed happy.
I suppose a lot of things changed when they moved to America. Jason started to talk about moving home. He wasn't happy. She was acting strange. He would open up and say they were having difficulties, and then he would change the subject.
When they moved to the US, I definitely started to notice more.
He died in his sleep. Or so she claimed, the shocking truth behind Jason Corbett's murder. A husband bludgeoned to death in his own bedroom. A blood-soaked crime scene that would haunt investigators for years. And the people responsible? His wife, and her father, a former FBI agent. But what if the story they told was all a lie? August 2, 2015. A frantic 911 call cuts through the silence of a North Carolina night. A man's voice trembles over the phone line. He says his son-in-law was attacking his daughter. He says he had no choice. He says he killed him. But when police arrive at the quiet home in Wahlberg, what they find doesn't match the story at all. There's no evidence of a struggle. No sign of self-defense. Just the lifeless body of a man, his skull crushed, his blood splattered across the walls, the floor, and the furniture. Standing over him, a calm woman and her father, neither with a single scratch on them. This is the story of Jason Corbett. An Irish father who crossed an ocean for love, only to discover that sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones we should fear. What began as a second chance at happiness would end in betrayal, manipulation, and a courtroom battle that spanned 2 continents. A story where truth is twisted, justice is delayed, and a killer walks free. Jason Corbett was a man trying to rebuild his life. After losing his first wife, Mags, to a sudden asthma attack in 2006, Jason was left alone to care for their 2 young children, Jack and Sarah. He was still in his early 30s, grieving, and struggling to balance fatherhood and work. He lived in Limerick, Ireland, where he was known for his warm personality, his quiet strength, and most of all, his devotion to his children. Jason knew he needed help. He began looking for a nanny, someone trustworthy, kind, and capable. That's when he met Molly Martens, a young American woman from North Carolina. She applied for the job and got it. At first, the relationship between Jason and Molly was strictly professional. But over time, a bond began to form. They grew closer. Eventually, that closeness turned into romance. And in 2011, the 2 were married. Jason made a life-changing decision. He packed up his children, left Ireland, and moved to the United States to begin a new chapter with Molly. They settled in Wahlberg, North Carolina, a quiet, green suburb that promised peace and normalcy. Jason found work. Molly stayed home. Jack and Sarah started school. To outsiders, it seemed like the perfect life. But behind closed doors, trouble was growing. Jason never allowed Molly to adopt Jack and Sarah. He held on to his parental rights tightly, perhaps out of respect for Mags, or maybe because he sensed something wasn't right. Molly, however, wanted legal control. She had left her country, embraced Jason's children, and taken on the role of a mother. But in Jason's eyes, she wasn't their real mother. This rejection became a sore spot for Molly. She began keeping a diary where she wrote about her feelings of inadequacy and frustration. Her entries revealed jealousy, emotional instability, and a growing sense of resentment. She claimed Jason was controlling. She told friends he was verbally abusive. She said she was scared of him. But there were no police reports, no documented injuries, and no evidence of the abuse she described. Meanwhile, Jason began to talk about returning to Ireland. He missed home. He wanted his children to grow up near their cousins, in the land where their mother was buried. Molly was against it. She refused to move. She feared that if Jason left, she would lose the children completely. Their arguments became more frequent. Tension filled the house. Jason's co-workers noticed changes in his behavior. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't say much, but they could tell something was wrong. At home, he confided in his sister, Tracy Lynch. He told her Molly was becoming manipulative. He was afraid she was trying to turn Jack and Sarah against him. Then came the breaking point. On the night of August 2, 2015, everything changed. Jason went to bed, unaware that this would be the last night of his life. Around 3 a.m., a 911 call came into the Davidson County Emergency Center. Thomas Martens, Molly's father, was on the line. He sounded panicked. He told the dispatcher that Jason was attacking his daughter, that he had to step in to save her. He said he hit Jason with a baseball bat. When police arrived at the scene, what they found was more brutal than they had expected. Jason's body was on the floor of the bedroom. His skull had been crushed. There was blood everywhere, on the carpet, on the walls, even spattered on the ceiling. He had been hit at least 12 times. A paving brick was also found nearby, also covered in blood. The room looked like a war zone. But strangely, Molly and her father had no injuries. No bruises. No scratches. No torn clothing. Nothing to suggest they had been in a violent struggle. And yet, they insisted Jason had attacked Molly and Thomas had simply defended her. Jack and Sarah were both in the house during the killing. Police found them unharmed in their rooms. When questioned, their responses echoed what Molly had told officers, that their father had been angry and violent. But even then, investigators felt something was off. The children sounded coached. Their words didn't match the chaos of the scene. And soon, the truth would begin to unravel. The hours after Jason Corbett's murder were filled with confusion, shock, and carefully crafted lies. At the scene, Molly Martens and her father, Thomas Martens, repeated the same story. Jason had attacked Molly, and Thomas had only intervened to save his daughter's life. They insisted it was self-defense. But the crime scene told a very different story. As investigators documented the bedroom, they were stunned by the amount of blood. It wasn't just a fatal assault, it was a brutal one. There was evidence of overkill. Jason had been hit at least 12 times in the head with a metal baseball bat and a landscaping brick. The impact had fractured his skull in multiple places. His brain showed signs of extensive trauma. There were splatters and pooling across the carpet, walls, and even the ceiling. Yet neither Molly nor Thomas had a mark on them. There were no scratches, no bruises, no torn clothing. No evidence that either of them had been in a violent struggle. For people who claimed to be fighting for their lives, they looked untouched. The police began to dig deeper. They secured search warrants, interviewed neighbors and family members, and began piecing together what had really been happening inside the Corbett household. What they discovered shifted the entire narrative. The first major contradiction came from the autopsy. The pathologist found no injuries on Jason that indicated he had been in control of the fight. There were no signs that he had attacked anyone. There were no fresh skin cells under his fingernails, no defensive wounds on his arms or hands, nothing to suggest that Jason had been in a position of aggression. In fact, there were signs that Jason may have been asleep when the first blow struck. The angle of the initial head wounds, the location of the blood pool, and the lack of defensive reactions painted a grim picture. Jason had been ambushed. He may never have had the chance to open his eyes. Investigators began to believe that the murder had not only been intentional, but possibly premeditated. Molly and Thomas were brought in for further questioning. They stuck to their story. They described Jason as an abuser. They insisted Molly was in danger. That Thomas had no choice. But every piece of physical evidence, every forensic detail, told a different story. The investigators also noted inconsistencies in the timeline. The 911 call had been made shortly after 3 a.m., but by the time officers arrived, the scene appeared strangely staged. Some items in the room had been cleaned or moved. Molly and Thomas had tried to comfort the children, but neighbors reported hearing no screams or loud arguments prior to the call, only the sirens. And then came the most suspicious detail of all. Molly and Thomas had already contacted a funeral home to cremate Jason's body before his family in Ireland even knew he was dead. They had also scheduled a professional cleaning service to come and sanitize the bedroom. It was as if they wanted to erase everything, quickly. When Jason's sister, Tracy Lynch, received the call that her brother had died, she was devastated. But when she learned how Molly and Thomas were handling his remains, her grief turned into suspicion. She flew from Ireland to North Carolina immediately, determined to protect her niece and nephew, and to find out what had really happened. Tracy met with local authorities and told them about Jason's recent concerns. About his plans to return to Ireland. About how Molly had begun behaving erratically. She explained that Jason had never shown any signs of being abusive. If anything, he was scared. He had expressed fear that Molly might harm him or manipulate the children. Authorities began taking Tracy seriously. They halted the cremation and began a full homicide investigation. Meanwhile, Jack and Sarah remained in North Carolina, but Tracy fought for custody. She argued that Molly had no legal parental rights over the children. The courts agreed. She was granted temporary guardianship, and the children were released into her care. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear in Molly's carefully constructed story. Once back in Ireland, away from Molly's influence, Jack and Sarah began to speak more freely. The story they had been told to tell, about their father's violence, began to fall apart. Jack, the older of the two, told Tracy that he had been confused. That Molly told them what to say. That she had explained how important it was to stick together. He admitted that what he'd said in those first interviews wasn't entirely true. Sarah echoed him. She said she didn't understand what had happened that night. That she thought something was wrong but didn't know what. That she was scared. Tracy brought this information to prosecutors, and it became a cornerstone of the case. Molly had not only orchestrated the murder, she had manipulated Jason's children into lying about it. The prosecution's theory was becoming clearer. Molly was desperate to control the children. She feared that Jason would take them back to Ireland, leaving her behind. And with the support of her father, Thomas, a man once trained by the FBI, she took matters into her own hands. The district attorney charged both Molly Martens and Thomas Martens with second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. The announcement made headlines across the United States and Ireland. The idea that a former federal agent and his daughter had killed a man in his sleep, and then tried to cover it up, was almost too shocking to believe. But the evidence was overwhelming. And the trial would expose even more. As the date of the trial approached, more details about Molly's past surfaced. She had previously accused another ex-boyfriend of abuse, an accusation that never led to charges. There were patterns of emotional instability and manipulation. And Thomas, though once a respected agent, had a reputation for being domineering and fiercely protective of his daughter, sometimes to an irrational degree. But what the prosecution had on their side was far more damning: forensics. Blood spatter analysis. Autopsy photos. Crime scene documentation. And now, the corrected statements from Jason's children. Molly's story was crumbling. So was Thomas's. Back in Ireland, Tracy Lynch worked tirelessly to keep the case in the public eye. She gave interviews. She met with advocacy groups. She stood as a symbol of truth, determined not to let Jason's murder be buried under false narratives and courtroom politics. Through her advocacy, the Irish media began covering the case extensively. And soon, it wasn't just a local tragedy, it was an international outrage. A man had been murdered in cold blood. His killers were pretending it was self-defense. And the justice system now had to decide whose story to believe. As the trial loomed, public interest surged. The courtroom would soon become the battleground for one of the most emotionally charged cases North Carolina had seen in decades. The courtroom was packed. Local reporters filled the front rows. Television crews hovered outside. And in the back, seated quietly, were Jason Corbett's family members, his sister Tracy, his brother-in-law David, and others who had flown in from Ireland to witness justice unfold. It was 2017, 2 years after Jason's brutal death. Molly Martens and her father, Thomas Martens, were standing trial for second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. The state was ready. And the world was watching. Opening arguments began with a clear message from the prosecution: Jason Corbett had been beaten to death in cold blood. Not during a moment of panic. Not during a desperate struggle. But with intention, and with force that far exceeded self-defense. The prosecutor described the crime scene as a slaughterhouse. Blood spatter lined the walls, ceiling, and baseboards. Jason had been hit so hard and so many times, his skull was crushed in multiple places. The prosecution played a video walkthrough of the crime scene, showing the jury just how violent the attack had been. There were audible gasps in the courtroom. Then came the autopsy photos. Jason's face was almost unrecognizable. His injuries extended from the top of his head to his jaw, and parts of his skull had fractured inward. The jury was silent as the medical examiner took the stand and calmly explained each wound. According to the examiner, Jason had likely been sleeping when the first blow landed. The trajectory of the wounds, the lack of defensive injuries, the angle of impact, all suggested that Jason never stood a chance. He didn't fight. He didn't defend himself. He was beaten to death before he even fully woke up. The defense opened with a very different story. They portrayed Jason as a volatile man. A father who controlled every detail of his wife's life. A man prone to explosive anger. They said Molly was terrified of him. That she had confided in friends, in family, in her diary. That she lived in fear, day after day, night after night. They described Thomas Martens as a man who acted to protect his daughter from being killed. A man who heard screams and ran to her aid with the only thing he could find, a baseball bat. They argued that this wasn't murder, it was a tragedy born out of terror and instinct. But under cross-examination, their claims began to unravel. The prosecution pointed out that neither Molly nor Thomas had reported any abuse to authorities prior to Jason's death. There were no hospital visits. No police reports. No calls to friends or family during arguments. Not even an email. Only private diary entries, written by Molly, for Molly. Then came the forensic experts. Crime scene analysts took the stand and walked the jury through the physics of the attack. Blood spatter patterns revealed the direction and intensity of the blows. According to experts, the attackers would have been standing over Jason, swinging downward, repeatedly. It wasn't defensive. It was deliberate. Relentless. The paving brick used in the murder wasn't something you'd find in a bedroom. It had been brought in from outside. A weapon by design. The prosecution asked the jury a chilling question: if Thomas acted in the heat of the moment, why was a landscaping brick used? Why bring that into the bedroom unless there was premeditation? But one of the most powerful moments in the trial came not from science, but from emotion. Tracy Lynch took the stand. She spoke with poise, but her grief was visible in every word. She described her brother as a devoted father. A man who had survived unimaginable loss when his first wife died. A man who only wanted to give his children a safe and loving home. She told the court how Jason had confided in her, how he feared Molly's behavior, how he wanted to return to Ireland. She explained how the children had changed after Molly came into their lives. How they became distant. How they repeated phrases that sounded too adult, too rehearsed. Then, Tracy revealed something that shocked even seasoned reporters. She described how, after gaining custody of Jack and Sarah, the children slowly admitted they had been told what to say. That Molly had instructed them to lie. That their father hadn't hurt anyone. That everything they'd said before had been wrong. Jack had told her, Molly said I had to tell the police Daddy was mean. But he wasn't. The courtroom fell silent. The defense scrambled to repair their narrative. They called character witnesses, former co-workers of Molly, family friends, even ex-boyfriends, who described her as sweet, vulnerable, emotionally fragile. They tried to present Thomas as a loving father, loyal, honorable, trained in law enforcement ethics. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They reminded the jury that Thomas was a trained FBI agent. That he understood evidence. That he knew how to handle crime scenes. That after the murder, he and Molly had tried to cremate Jason's body almost immediately. Before his family even knew he was dead. They reminded the jury that the pair had scheduled a cleaning service to come wipe the scene, erasing not just blood, but perhaps the truth as well. It didn't take long for the jury to deliberate. After days of testimony, hours of closing arguments, and countless graphic images, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty, for both Molly Martens and Thomas Martens. Guilty of second-degree murder. Jason's family wept in the courtroom. Tracy held her breath as the words were read. Justice, after 2 long years of agony and doubt, had finally been served. The judge sentenced both Molly and Thomas to 20 to 25 years in prison. The defense stood in stunned silence. Molly stared ahead, expressionless. Thomas lowered his head. There were no screams. No protests. Only the sound of the gavel and the quiet murmur of justice settling in. The reaction outside the courthouse was explosive. News outlets across the US and Ireland picked up the verdict. Headlines declared the story, stepmother and retired FBI agent convicted in bludgeoning death of Irish father. In Limerick, a crowd gathered outside the Corbett family home. Supporters brought candles. They stood in quiet solidarity with the family. For them, Jason wasn't just a headline, he was a brother, a son, a father, a friend. Tracy gave a brief statement to the press. Her voice was calm, but resolute. She said, "This verdict doesn't bring Jason back. But it tells the truth. And that matters. It matters for his children, and it matters for justice." But even as she spoke, there were murmurs in legal circles that this case wasn't over. Defense attorneys were already preparing to file appeals. They believed the trial had been unfair. That evidence had been excluded. That key witnesses weren't allowed to testify. For Jason's family, the verdict felt like a turning point. But behind the scenes, a storm was already gathering. Justice had been delivered. But whether it would last, that remained uncertain. Part 4, The Overturn and the Deal That Changed Everything. 3 years after Molly Martens and her father, Thomas Martens, were convicted of Jason Corbett's murder and sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison, everything changed. In 2020, a North Carolina appeals court overturned both convictions. The reason? The judges ruled that the trial court had improperly excluded certain pieces of evidence that could have supported Molly and Thomas's claims of self-defense. The ruling didn't say they were innocent. It simply said that the jury hadn't been allowed to see the full picture. For Jason's family, it was like reliving the nightmare all over again. They had sat through every moment of the trial. They had listened to the 911 calls, the forensic details, the lies, and they believed that justice had been done. But now, that justice had been undone with a single decision. Molly and Thomas were granted a new trial. And suddenly, everything was back on the table. Tracy Lynch, Jason's sister, spoke publicly, calling the overturn a cruel twist. She wasn't just worried about the verdict being erased, she was terrified the killers might walk free. And then came the next blow. In 2023, with a new trial looming, the state made a decision that shocked nearly everyone. They offered Molly and Thomas a plea deal. Rather than retrying the case in court, the prosecution allowed both defendants to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, a far lesser charge. Both agreed. Because they had already served time, the sentence was reduced to time served. Molly and Thomas Martens were released from prison in June 2024, after spending fewer than 4 years behind bars. The reaction was swift and emotional. Jason's family, devastated. His children, older now, faced with the fact that the people responsible for their father's death were now free. The public, outraged. Social media exploded with anger. News anchors debated whether justice had truly been served. But the law had spoken. And this time, it was final. The killers were free. When Molly and Thomas Martens walked out of prison in 2024, free people, they left behind more than just a courtroom and a criminal record. They left behind 2 children, Jack and Sarah, who had witnessed the worst kind of betrayal. Their father had been murdered. Their stepmother and grandfather, the people they had once trusted, had taken him from them. By then, the children were teenagers, living in Ireland under the care of their aunt, Tracy Lynch. In the years since Jason's death, Tracy had done everything she could to give them a safe, stable life. She didn't just provide a home, she gave them truth. Protection. A place to heal. Jack and Sarah rarely spoke publicly about what happened. But those close to them say they were changed forever by that night. Grief was one thing. Confusion and betrayal were another. They had been used. Coached. Forced to lie to cover up a murder. That kind of manipulation leaves scars no sentence, short or long, can undo. Tracy stepped into more than just a guardian role. She became an advocate. For Jason. For his children. And for families around the world who've lost loved ones to violence but struggled to see justice done. She gave interviews. She worked with victim support organizations. She kept Jason's story alive, not for revenge, but for truth. And for the message it carried, that behind closed doors, even in quiet homes, terrible things can happen. That love isn't always what it seems. That control can wear the mask of concern. That silence can be deadly. Tracy once said, "I will never let Jason be forgotten." His children deserve to grow up knowing their father was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. And the world needs to remember that. Even now, years after Jason Corbett's murder, questions remain. What was Molly's real motive? Some say it was about control. She wanted to be the children's legal mother, and Jason stood in the way. Others point to money. A life insurance policy. Financial fear if Jason left. And some believe it was deeper, a mix of rejection, rage, and obsession. A desire not just to win, but to erase. And what about Thomas Martens? Was he blindly loyal to his daughter? Or did he know more than he admitted? Did he believe her stories of abuse? Or did he help plan what happened that night? One of the most haunting questions is the simplest: could this have been prevented? Jason told people he was uneasy. He confided in his sister. He made plans to return to Ireland. But no one imagined Molly and her father were capable of murder. Not like this. Not with bricks and bats in the dead of night. And the children? They've lost more than most will ever understand. They lost a father. They were used as tools in a deadly lie. And now they carry the weight of it forever. In the end, this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a story of control. Of a family torn apart by obsession. And of a justice system that gave, then took away, its verdict. Jason Corbett crossed an ocean for love. He trusted. He believed. He tried to build a family again. But behind that dream was a danger he never truly saw, until it was too late. Now, all that remains is memory. And truth. So we ask you. What do you think happened that night? Was justice truly served? Let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts. Share this story. And if you believe Jason Corbett deserves to be remembered, not for how he died, but for how he lived, hit subscribe. Because stories like his deserve to be heard. Always.